Yes.
May it please the court, Your Honor. Members of the jury, the defendant's lies cannot hide the truth that was written with the victim's blood. Today you learned how Willie James was bleeding from multiple injuries to his head. And when he was separated from the defendant, it was the defendant who had no visible injuries but was covered in blood. The defendant had blood on his shoes, on his pants, on his sweatshirt. Even his hands were covered in blood. And he tried to wash this blood away with lies. He lied when he said he didn't drive that night. He lied when he said he didn't use anything other than his fists and his elbows to fight Willie. And he lied about even owning a flashlight. But members of the jury, these lies cannot wash away the truth that was written with blood. Let's take a moment and look beyond the lies. You heard a lot about Willie James. He's a war veteran. He fought 3 tours in Iraq to protect our freedom. But he wasn't just fighting to protect our freedom, also to support his family. He's a hard-working husband and a father of 2 young children. And that night, after leaving, he was just trying to go home. Now, you also heard a lot about the defendant. And this is a young kid who's a self-described adrenaline junkie. Loves challenges. The bigger the challenge, the better. October 2nd, 2014, that was no different. Because he saw his next challenge in war veteran Willie James. Now, Willie was hanging out with one of his friends, J.T. Sanborn. They had recently just finished up their last tour and finally had some time to relax. So they went to a football game. Now, while they were out, Willie had a couple of beers. So he decided to do the responsible thing. Even though he wasn't drunk, he handed his keys over to the designated driver, J.T., who hadn't been drinking. They then went to the 7-Eleven to go grab a bite to eat. And it's while they were there that they ran into the defendant. You see, Willie saw the defendant knock a drink over on the ground. The iced tea spilled everywhere, causing a mess. And Willie felt bad for the employees. So he went up to this kid, the defendant, and said, "Clean it up." But the defendant wasn't listening. The defendant started to mouth off at him. Willie realized it was pointless, so he decided to leave. As they were leaving, it was then that he was chased down, because the defendant continued his challenge. The defendant got in his car, raced and cut Willie off, slamming on his brakes right in front of Willie's trunk. Now, Willie didn't know what was going on. He stood on the side of the truck waving this kid to go around, but it wasn't working, so he had to get out. He got out of the truck, and he started to approach the defendant, telling him it's time to move along. But what did the defendant do? He just smirked at him, and then he flipped him off. Now, Willie was understandably frustrated at this point. He just wanted to go home to his family. So, he tapped on the car, told him to move along. But it didn't work. He eventually started to go back to the truck. Then he was blindsided, because the defendant pulled out a large metal flashlight, a maglite, and hit Willie James in the head, causing multiple injuries, causing blood to run down his head. And then the defendant wrestled him on the ground. Police arrived at the scene, and they pulled him off. They saw Willie had a scrape on his head, multiple injuries. His eye was swollen shut. He had to be rushed to the hospital. But the defendant, he didn't have a scrape on him. But what he did have was the victim's blood on his shoes, on his pants, on his sweatshirt, even his hands. He tried to wash that away with lies to the officer. He said he wasn't driving, and that was a lie. He lied when he said he only used his fists and his elbows to fight Willie, But members of the jury, these lies can't wash away the truth that was written in blood. And that is why the defendant sits before you on charges of first-degree assault and disorderly conduct. Now, we, the state, we hold the burden of proving to you beyond a reasonable doubt each and every element of our charges. Now, this is a burden that we embrace today. To prove to you first-degree assault, we must prove that the defendant acted with the intent to cause serious bodily injury, that he did cause that serious bodily injury, and that he did so through use of a deadly weapon. Now, to prove to you disorderly conduct, we have to show that the defendant knowingly, intentionally, or recklessly engaged in a fight with Willie in a public place. Now, disorderly conduct, that's pretty clear. An officer arrived at the scene, and they separated them. They saw that the defendant was actively engaged in a fight with Willie James in a public parking lot. We provided you with that evidence today. Now, assault in the first degree, it's just as clear because the evidence was written with blood. The intent to cause serious bodily injury. Today, you heard how the defendant took this large metal flashlight, a 30-inch heavy flashlight, and he struck Willie James in the skull. And then you heard about the injuries from two separate witnesses. Multiple injuries to the head, a scrape at the top of the head, a deep laceration on the side of the head, enough lacerations that they needed almost 30 stitches, and then a broken eye socket. The intent was clear, to cause those injuries with the multiple blows with that flashlight. And the injuries were serious. And he was rushed to the hospital and treated for those injuries I just talked about. And the judge will explain to you that a fracture, that's a serious bodily injury. And also just the risk of impairment of a bodily organ, that's enough as well. And you heard today that he required x-rays and CT scans to see if there was impairment to his brain. That is a serious bodily injury. And the defendant used a deadly weapon. The judge will explain to you what that means. That if an instrument is used to bludgeon a victim, that's a deadly weapon. And today you heard how a flashlight, a maglite, was used to bludgeon Willie James. This is a deadly weapon. We proved all of our elements to you today beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, as you go into deliberation, you start thinking about what this burden means. It's important to remember what it does not mean. Because beyond a reasonable doubt, that's not beyond all doubt. It's not beyond a shadow of doubt. A reasonable doubt is not possible, a speculative, imaginary, fanciful, or forced doubt. This is a doubt that is truly founded in reason. But there is only one reasonable explanation for why Willie had multiple injuries, serious injuries to his head, why he was bleeding from his head, while the defendant sat there without a single injury, covered in the victim's blood. The only explanation is his guilt, and the truth of that guilt was written with blood. We proved our case to you today through two witnesses. First, we called Officer McNulty to the stand. She explained what she did when she arrived on the scene. She explained how she saw the individuals, how she saw the defendant engaged in a fight with Willie James, and how when she separated them, she saw serious injuries on Willie and not a single injury on the defendant, who was covered with blood. And then she also told you how the defendant lied to her multiple times. Lied about driving, lied when he said he only used his fists and his elbows to fight Willie James, and lied when he said he didn't even own a flashlight. But these lies couldn't wash away that blood. Now, the next witness you heard from was the defendant, or the next witness you heard from was the victim, Willie James. When he took the stand, he explained to you the types of injuries he received. He explained to you how he felt something hard hit his head. He felt that strike his head, and it was too late. He tried to fight to protect himself, but there was nothing he could do because he was blindsided. He was attacked. He was brutally attacked by the defendant. And he had to be rushed to the hospital and treated for those injuries. Today, we proved our case through these two witnesses. Now, after we presented our case, the defense had their own opportunity. Now, they tried to convince you that this is a case of self-defense. Now, self-defense requires proving that the defendant thought there was an unlawful attack by Willie. And he responded to that attack with the amount of force necessary, reasonably necessary, to prevent the harm. Members of the jury, the evidence doesn't support an attack by Willie James. But let's just take a moment and assume it does. Reasonable force. The amount of force necessary to prevent the harm. Well, you heard about the harm that the defendant claims he has. A small bruise on his leg. That is not enough to cause him to pull out that large maglite and strike Willie James in the head, not once, but multiple times, as his injury showed. This is not the amount of force necessary to prevent this bruise on his leg. Now, as the defense called their two witnesses, my co-counsel had to keep a question in mind. What lies did you hear? Well, first you heard from the defendant. And as we told you, he lied when he said that he was only using his fists and his elbows to fight Willie James. And he lied when he said he didn't drive that night. And he lied when he said he didn't even own a flashlight. And then when he took the stand today, he explained that the reason he lied was because he was scared. Scared of getting in trouble for driving that night. Scared of getting in trouble for hitting Willie James with that flashlight. Because when he's scared, he lies. Then he also told you he is here today on charges of assault and disorderly conduct. Two very serious charges. And again, he is scared. We all know what he does when he's scared. All you have seen is lie on top of lie on top of lie. But these lies cannot hide the truth that was written with blood. Now, the next witness they called was Kelly Bradshaw, the supposed eyewitness, who didn't really see much of anything. She arrived after the fight started, didn't see who hit who first, and what she saw didn't even line up with what the defendant said. She never saw his door slamming repeatedly into his legs. But what's more important than what she saw or she didn't see is what she said. Because again, like the defendant, she lied. She lied when she said that Willie was egging the defendant on. Because she took the stand today and said, well, she doesn't even know what she meant by that. And then she lied when she said that she was already parked when she saw this incident. She told the officer that she was walking around and saw the fight. But then she took the stand today and said that she saw it as she was driving by. Members of the jury, all you heard from the defense today was lies. But these lies cannot wash away the truth that was written with the victim's blood. Don't allow them to wash away this truth with lies. Find the defendant guilty.
Defense?
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. The state is seeing only what they want you to see. Earlier today, Mr. Ady came in front of you and told you a story about the big docile lab and the tiny ferocious terrier, and about how his dad automatically assumed, just because of the dog sizes, that the lab took the biscuits off the counter. However, when they actually looked at what was in front of them, followed the crumbs, traced the trail, they found that it was actually the terrier that had taken the biscuits off the table. That is exactly what has happened in this case. William James is the smaller terrier. Pete Mitchell is the larger Labrador. And just because of the size of Pete Mitchell versus the size of William James when the officer got on the scene, the officer didn't follow any of those crumbs, didn't follow any of the trail of evidence to find out what really happened in the case. The state is seeing only what they want to see. And in order to try to sell that story to you, they've called 2 witnesses to the stand today. And first they called Officer McNulty, and she told you that she had 25 years of experience. But just because she has 25 years of experience doesn't mean that she's a good officer. And it doesn't mean that you should take what she's saying as the truth without questioning what it is that she says up on the stand. Because she told you a lot of things that didn't really add up. Because first she told you that she saw everything. But then when we looked at the map, we realized that she didn't really see anything until she actually pulled into the parking lot. She also denied ever even going into the 7-Eleven or talking to other witnesses. She talked about how she grabbed evidence barehanded and that safety was her #1 priority, yet she didn't really do anything to keep anyone safe other than William James. You also heard from William James himself, who got up on the stand and told you that, yes, he was the very first person to go up to Pete Mitchell in the store. That, yes, he was the very first person to get out of his car. And yes, he was the person that went up to Pete Mitchell's car to tell him to move it. If you follow the evidence that Mr. James gives you, it shows you that he was the first aggressor in this situation. That if it weren't for his actions, none of this would have even happened. And you and I and everyone else in this courtroom heard the testimony that was given from several different people. And we weren't there. You and I were not at the 7-Eleven. But because of the evidence that's been shown, we know exactly what happened. We know that Pete Mitchell was automatically judged for having his long hair, and that the 2 military-looking men came up to him at the 7-Eleven and ordered him to clean up something that he didn't do. And he said he wasn't going to do it. And these were orders that Mr. James was used to having followed. But Pete left. He left the situation and he got in his car and he tried to leave, but he wasn't able to leave because J.T. Sanborn and William James had another idea in their mind. They knew that they could stop him and pin him in the parking lot. So they did. They got in their big car and they zoomed up and they stopped, blocking Pete in. And then Mr. James got out of his car and apparently asked him to move, but that wasn't good enough. So not 1, but 2 people then got out of the right car. They got out of his truck, and J.T. Sanborn stood right in front of where Mr. Mitchell's car was. And William James went around to the door and started banging on it, yelling things, yelling military commands that he was used to yelling when he was in a battle situation. And for Mr. James, this was another battle situation. This is a situation where someone wasn't following the orders that he was given. And so he was going to force him to follow his orders. So Mr. James opened up that car door, and as Pete went to get out, he started slamming that door over and over and over again, leaving Pete Mitchell with the only option that he had, which was to defend himself. So yeah, they got in a fight, and they were wrestling on the ground, and William James himself doesn't deny that. He told you he pled guilty to it. He pled guilty to disorderly conduct for fighting. He didn't say self-defense. He didn't say that he was attacked first. He admitted guilt to fighting. He said that under oath here today. He admitted to doing exactly what we're here for. Now, the burden of proof in this case rests with the state. We could have sat back here at this table, kicked up our heels, and not said a single word to you because we don't have to prove anything. And not only does the state have to prove one thing, they have to prove 2 things. 1, they have to prove disorderly conduct and assault in first degree. And then 2, they have to prove that this wasn't self-defense on behalf of Pete Mitchell. And they have to prove both of these things to you beyond a reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt is one of those things that causes you to hesitate before acting. Now, I have an older brother that was a little bit more defiant than me when we were growing up. He used to love to slam doors, especially when he didn't get his way. And he would march up those stairs and he would slam those doors constantly, whenever mom or dad was yelling at him for something. And I remember my daddy one day saying, "John, if you slam that door one more time, I'm going to have to punish you. You're going to get a whipping." My brother, obviously being the person that he was, he marched up those stairs just like he always did. And he went into his bedroom and the door slammed real loud. My dad said, looked at my mom and said, Pam, gotta go do it. So my dad went up the stairs and he went into my brother's room, opened up the door. He sat there and he said, John, you know what's gonna happen. You know, I told you, if you slam this door one more time, I'm gonna have to leave you a spanking. I'm gonna have to whoop you. And so my dad raised his hand up, and just as he went to spank my brother, he felt the wind gust hit his hand. And he hesitated before he acted. Because he realized that maybe it wasn't my brother that slammed the door, but maybe it was the wind gust from the window that was open that caused it to slam. That hesitation before acting, that is reasonable doubt. And that is all throughout this case. Now the state wants to talk to you about lies that cannot be covered up with blood, but what lies have they told you today? Officer McNulty got on that stand and told you that there were several people that he took statements from. He named people, or she named people left and right that are never in her statement. That was a lie. She also told you that there was no way that that red truck could have gotten out of this parking lot. This was drawn by Officer McNulty. These measurements taken by Officer McNulty. This is fair and accurate representation of that parking lot. This exit, 34 feet. The length of this car, 14 feet, 3 inches. 20 additional feet for that car, that red truck, to get out of that parking lot. I don't know about you, but I've never seen a truck in my life that is 20 feet from left to right. That was another lie by the state. And what about the lies from William James? William James got up here on the stand and he told you that he absolutely knew that he was hit in the head with that flashlight. It wasn't until he was confronted with that lie that he said, oh, well, now I just know from other people. Other people told me that I was hit in the head by that flashlight. Those are lies in and of themselves. So what facts are the state trying to hide by lying to you today? Now, once I'm done talking with you, the state will have an opportunity to come up and talk to you one last time. And I want you to keep in mind 3 things that they cannot prove and 3 questions that they cannot answer. They cannot explain to you why 2 men got out of the car to approach 1 man to ask him to move his car if it wasn't to start a fight. And they cannot explain to you how Pete Mitchell got those marks across his legs if it wasn't that the door was being slammed on him. And what they can't do is deny the fact that William James's military history followed him home, and that night he was in another battle. And because they can't answer those questions, the only thing you can do is find Pete Mitchell not guilty.
Any rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor, one moment. May it please the court.
Yes.
Your Honor, members of the jury, the defense tried to say that we're only seeing what we want to see. That when the officer arrived at the scene, she only saw what she wanted to see. But members of the jury, what did she see? Well, first she saw the defendant, a lanky man, as he described himself, not very intimidating. And then she saw the victim, Willie James, a built military man with a neck tattoo. He's been described as looking intimidating. But she didn't just look at what she wanted to see. She didn't judge them based on the way that she looked. What she saw were the facts that were written with blood. Because she saw that this large military man with a neck tattoo actually was the one with multiple injuries to his skull. And how it was the defendant, this smaller, lanky man, who was covered in blood without a single injury. It was the blood on his hands that told her the truth about what happened. And the lies that you heard from the defendant couldn't wash that away today. The truth was written for you in blood. Now, opposing counsel said that we will be unable to answer a few different questions and pose them to you. Why does it take 2 men to approach the defendant in his car? blocked him in the parking lot. They were repeatedly asking him, waiting on him to move. They didn't know what was about to happen. So they got out of the car, and they went to approach him to tell him to move. It obviously wasn't because they were both trying to be involved in this fight. As you heard today, that there was never any mention of JT ever hitting the defendant. They got out of the car to see what was going on. Now the next question they said that we would be unable to answer was why Pete had these marks on his leg. Members of the jury, when you take a look at this injury, all that is a bruise on his leg. Now we don't have a timestamp on there. We don't know when this picture was taken. We don't know where it came from because he never went to the doctor. There are many ways to explain having a bruise on your leg, other than the story he told in court today, the story that he never once told an officer. There are plenty of ways to explain that. Now the final question they asked was, if we could deny whether or not Willie's military past carried him home, whether he was engaged in that same type of military thing that day. Members of the jury, Willie took the stand today and explained that this wasn't a battle. He didn't think he was in combat. Instead, he was beaten, blindsided, hit and fell on the ground, and all he was trying to do was go home to his family. Members of the jury, the truth was written with blood. Do not allow the defense to wash it away with lies. Find the defendant guilty.